So I just want to start with a land acknowledgement from Utah. I am situated in Logan, Utah at Utah State University. We are a land grant institution. Our campuses and centers reside and operate on the territories of the 8 tribes of Utah who have been living, working, and residing on this land from time immemorial. These tribes are the Confederated Tribes of the Goshute Indians, Navajo Nation, Ute Indian Tribe, Northwestern Band of Shoshone, Paiute Indian Tribe of Utah, San Juan Southern Paiute, Skull Valley Band of Goshute, and White Mesa Band of the Ute Mountain Ute. We acknowledge these lands carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. We recognize elders past and present as people who have cared for and continue to care for the land. In offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous self-governance history, experiences, and resiliency of the Native people who are still here today. And I'll drop this link in the chat for those of you who are interested in looking up which Indigenous land you are on in your own location. Okay, so today's event, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have 3 speakers. I won't introduce them with long bios. If they want to introduce themselves more, they will do that at their talk. But we're going to go in this order. We're going to start with Attila, who's going to talk about teaching publicity, privacy, and secrecy with opensecrets.org and market research data. And then we're going to go to Calvin, who will talk about genre-based technical communication pedagogy with, for, and against ChatGPT. And then finally, we're going to have Reed, who's the digital initiative librarian archivist at College of Southern Idaho, to talk about deliberately safeguarding privacy and confidentiality in the era of generative AI. So we're going to go through all those 3 speakers and then do Q&A at the end. So Attila, turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Attila Halsby, and I just want to check in. Can you all see the slides that I've posted?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. So my presentation is titled "We Live in Public, Teaching Publicity, Privacy, and Secrecy." I have omitted the open secrets and market research component of the original title because in retrospect, I realized that this would be, there were other better tie-ins to generative AI that I can highlight. And in the interest of moving in that direction, I've shortened my title a little bit and also changed the emphasis to not focus on those specific exercises and websites. Let me start my timer here. The presentation I'd like to give to you has a couple of parts. I'm going to briefly introduce myself, and then I have 3 different moves that I'd like to make in the course of this presentation. First, I want to just introduce the concepts of the secret and the private, and specifically offer some justification for why I tend to move toward secrecy rather than privacy in my teaching. Second, I'd like to talk about secrecy and privacy in relationship to generative AI, and specifically in relationship to data visualization or the visualizations that are available through platforms like Meta and E2. And then finally, I want to offer some teaching resources that are, in accord with the theme of today's presentation, which is mostly about pedagogy. So a little bit about myself. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. Since about 2016, I've been researching the rhetoric of secrecy, and secrecy being a fairly capacious term that touches on a variety of different issues, including, but not limited to, things like public scandals, secret dog whistles, national security leaking discourse, and finally, settler colonialism. And in keeping with those themes, settler colonialism is something I want to touch on here as one of the reasons why we want to touch on secrecy, and especially to put it into contact with something like generative AI as a topic. So allow me to move to the secret and the private. And here, I think that the key phrase that I will come back to at the end is that when privacy is impossible, secrecy is the only option, or secrecy is inevitable. And there are a lot of reasons why that is the case, but I'd like to just offer my definition of these terms and then to explain a little bit more what I mean by the secret or secrecy. So first, why secrecy? In a lot of ways, before surveillance studies was an emergent area in the early 2000s for communication studies and technical communication and a variety of other disciplines, there was a moment where during the Iraq War and the war on Afghanistan by the United States, that there were a lot of scholars who were concentrating on the topic of secrecy instead. And so secrecy as a topic not only predates, but also is an expansive topic that encompasses some of the things that we talk about in relationship to surveillance. But at this point in time, it's almost as though surveillance has overtaken secrecy as a topic area. I think that secrecy is an important area for us to consider specifically because it captures the dyad of intimacy and oppression. Secrecy is what enables something like resistance movements to transpire, for us to develop bonds of kinship in environments that are safe and that allow us to know that our communication is protected, but it's also the recipe for hierarchical forms of oppression, specifically top-down enforcements of power. As a rhetorician myself, I believe that terms like secrecy and privacy gain precision by being put into a web of other related terms, and the differences between those terms are fairly meaningful. And specifically, the other related terms that I would point back to are topics like publicity, transparency, surveillance, conspiracy, and of course, privacy. Um, and I'd like to just make two brief points about first publicity and then also about the relationship between AI and secrecy. First, publicity is often thought of as a voluntary construct, something that we can opt to perform. It's a choice that we make as individuals or as collectives to publicize ourselves, to make ourselves visible. But more and more, I think that there's value in thinking about publicity as something that is not chosen, but instead enforced as a kind of norm. In other words, when we engage with one another, including on platforms like this one, we are put into a public frame in ways that we may not necessarily anticipate or know. And that's really what I try to impart in classes like this rhetoric of secrecy and surveillance. It's that publicity isn't just something that we can choose to do. Sometimes publicity exceeds our conscious choices, and that's part of what encroaches on our sense that we have anything like a private life whatsoever. Second, secrecy infects and invades all of these different areas as well. And this is just one example that I have up on the screen where AI is being used as a message for a very old technique of secret keeping called steganography, which allows an image that appears to be somewhat innocuous, can be a meme, to encode a message that can only be deciphered by those who have the tools available to them. And so there, I think that when we're thinking about generative AI, sometimes the more things change, the more they stay the same. And in this case, it's not an exception with the way that memes can be encoded with messages that can be deciphered or that can transmit more and less dangerous messages. In the classes that I teach, and I do apologize for the amount of text on the next two slides here. I'm not going to read through them, obviously, but these are slides that I actually use in the classroom. I often go through the distinction between the private and the secret. The private is a term that is significantly younger than the term the secret and typically refers to a couple of things. First, it refers to a set of rights, which is part of the reason why it is so strongly featured, for instance, this week, and why I'm really grateful to be presenting with the DRPC this week as well, in that it is something that we can assert as something that we deserve, that we are in need of, that wanes and waxes. It's also something that is defined as a negative in the sense that it's defined consistently against publicity, such that the private individual is typically what was at the very least once understood as something that was outside of the purview of public authorities. And so there is that distinction between public and private, such that the private individual is that which exceeds or goes beyond the kind of authority exercised by an official institution or a sovereign. And finally, in argumentation studies, it's a place where informal claims are being leveraged. Secrecy, by contrast, has an older etymology that dates back to Rome and really boils down to a few different terms, but two that I want to highlight here, which are arcanum and secretum. Arcanum refers to the secret, like the state secret, which once locked, it just doesn't get unlocked ever again. There is a sense that some secrets are so precarious, should they be revealed, that it is necessary to keep them out of sight and out of mind in perpetuity. Secretum refers to a deliberate, and this is the root of secrecy itself, refers to the deliberate flow of information from a position of authority to a wider public. And there, it's the sense that some things remain hidden while other things remain out in the open. And power is exercised through the controlling or the throttling of that flow of information. Importantly, these two terms have a direct relationship to topics related to settler colonialism, insofar as they appear in popular culture, and also there are widely recognizable examples that we can tether to each. On the left-hand side, there's a popular example of Arcanum, which is the Ark of the Covenant. Obviously, the word Ark, having that etymological connection to Arcanum, where literally opening the Ark of the Covenant and Indiana Jones, a quintessential settler movie, results in the deaths of everyone who is gazing upon it or who sought to open it in the first place. And so you have that deadly secret, which unleashed on the world it has these devastating effects and must ultimately, at the end of the film, spoiler alert, get sealed away in a government archive somewhere. Secretum, on the other hand, refers to the action of a sieve where some information flows through and some stays up top, and the really important information remains within the control of the person who is handling the sieve. And so there is this etymological connection, there is this historical connection that we can make between something like secrecy and settler colonialism, especially when we put it into relationship with terms of governance. Now, the title of my presentation is that we live in public, and often there is nothing that we can really do about it. And the great example of this are the significant number of leaks that have transpired in public. And here, there's one leak after another leak after another leak where information moves from our own personal private data out into public, and often we are only the recipients of this information on the back end of such leaks. And so in terms of making a justification to students, why do we study this? This is part of the reason why, because we need to think about the degree to which we are ourselves in control of the information that we decide to disseminate. In particular, right, there are a lot of ways that information is disseminated without our consent, but also that has to do with information that we would consider deeply private to us. And so here, on the one hand, I have a couple of examples with 23andMe, which I'm going to go through, which I'm going to pass by somewhat quickly. But also, it's worth noting that the biggest leaks that have happened of user data, of our own private information, are often underpublicized, with many of the leaks that I've listed here going unmentioned relative to, say, the Equifax leak or the Target leak, which don't even make the top list in this case. I think the best example of this is the Ashley Madison leak, which was salacious and scandalous, but also doesn't even breach the top 10. The most potent example, I think, of privacy, when privacy not being an option, secrecy is inevitable, it's the only option, are recent surveillance-related laws that are oriented toward pregnant people who are seeking reproductive care in circumstances of abortion or gender-affirming care. And there, once again, right, when privacy is no longer an option, when privacy is eroded, there is this intimate connection to something like secrecy, because secrecy becomes the only means available in order to seek out that care. So the second part of the presentation, or the second element that I want to talk about here, is secrecy and privacy in relationship to generative AI. One of the things that I do tell students whenever I am starting to teach class and invoking generative AI is that they themselves are training data anytime that they are inputting their information. There is a privacy contract that is implicitly being signed that goes beyond the EULA agreement that they click through, or that they must engage, insofar as they themselves are submitting information that will guide future iterations of AI. And so, again, like secrecy, there is a benefit and a drawback. It may be a good way to engage in an iterative process of revision with their own writing, and there is an unethical stance if you just accept the outputs of generative AI as if they are enough. However, anytime that they are doing that, engaging with these technologies, it's important to know that they are submitting themselves for as the raw material for future iterations of the very technology that they are seeking to use. I also put this into terms of, like, this is not a new phenomenon. On the right, you have like a still image from Soylent Green, and on the left, you have an updated version for AI with Lawrence Fishburne reprising a kind of Matrix-like role in the 2014 Signal, where he emerges at the very end of the film as an AI that has duped a number of college students from MIT into thinking that he was in fact human. And so that's the sense that I'm trying to go after, in that you are the training data. Soylent Green is people that our data is being sort of fed off into domains that we cannot necessarily trace. If we redefine some of the terms that I introduced earlier in the presentation for generative AI, I think that all three of the categories I introduced are still relevant. First, the reason why we turn to settler colonialism as a frame for generative AI is that it establishes a key purpose and a series of topoi for why it is that we need to be critical of the technologies that we engage with. Generative AI engages topics of property and possession insofar as it begs the question of whose data it is that once it is input into generative AI. It also expands the notion of the frontier beyond physical borders into a digital space, such that there is always a new space to be colonized, in this case, the private information of the users who would supply it, the training data. And then finally, the question of resource extraction, which is directly tied to the question of labor, and specifically the obsolescence of labor, the replacement of labor that is dull, dirty, and dangerous, or alternatively, the extraction of labor from the global south and from the discourse of diverse populations, which are no longer necessary should generative AI just be able to substitute them in contexts like filmmaking or television programming or anything that would require writing. In relationship to privacy and secrecy, privacy is almost overwhelmingly on the side of the user, while secrecy is on the side of the interface. And here I really only want to highlight one thing in order to get to my final example, which is that if we are thinking about privacy, then we're thinking about the responsibility of the user and the limited degree to which they can control their own information when they're using generative AI. If we're thinking about secrecy, we're thinking about a property of the AI itself, and specifically thinking about ways that we can test the AI to see what its biases are. Most prominently, the way to test AI has to do with algorithm audits, especially because of the black box nature of many generative AI systems and social media writ large. And I want to go to an example of that kind of an audit right now. And granted, like I'm going to point to Meta and to DALL-E 2 as instances where this sort of an audit can take place. Just as setup, when I approach these websites in the classroom, the phrase that I'm using is the greatest threat to humankind or some equivalent of that. And I just want to give you a snapshot of the kinds of images that are generated when those prompts are fed into the system. With Meta AI, overwhelmingly, there are portraits, and specifically portraits that are either feminized or that depict brown and black people that have been artificially that have been artificially generated. Here, there is something that is text-like, but does not actually resemble text. But ultimately, right, generative AI as a mirror image of the inputs that are being put into the system generates overwhelmingly racialized frames, feminized frames that for public consumption. The same thing is true of the DALL-E 2.0, which also does the same. And so I'm running out of time, which is why I'm accelerating a little bit here, but the point that I'm trying to make here is that when we're teaching secrecy from the point of view of generative AI, thinking about how it is that we can probe these systems or test these systems in ways that make it apparent that the systems themselves are reflecting biases, that they are imperfect reflections, also tempers the desire to use these, the outputs of these as if they were fully formed products in the first place. And that's really the lesson that I want to impart to students when I'm teaching it. The last thing that I have in this presentation are some teaching resources, which I'm going to just link into the chat here. These include a textbook that I've organized with a section on digital rhetoric, and then also a private blog website that has pages on the rhetoric of secrecy and surveillance and a graduate seminar on rhetorical theory. And so with that, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you listening, and I appreciate the platform to be able to talk to DR.
Thank you so much, Attila. Turn over to Calvin.
All right, let me test my screen sharing. Okay, can you all see this?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay. So thank you so much for being here, joining this event. I'm really honored to be on this panel with my co-panelists. And I think there's actually a fair amount of conceptual overlap between what I'm going to be talking about and what Attila just talked about. So I think this has actually turned out to be a really nice order, even though we kind of like just came up with the order fairly randomly. So I love when happy accidents happen like that on panels. So the title of my talk is Navigating Publicity and Privacy in Technical Communication, Genre-Based Pedagogy with, for, and against ChatGPT. I'm Calvin Pollock, PhD, he, him pronouns, and I'm an assistant teaching professor of technical and professional communication at the University of Washington in Seattle. All right, so the basic claim that I'm going to start with in this talk is that in tech comm education, I believe we can use large language models like ChatGPT in service of our pedagogical goals, but there's a really heavy asterisk here and connects to some of the things that Attila was just discussing, which is that we can do this if and only if we make space for students to study the significant issues of privacy and publicity around these tech. And I want to clarify what I mean by privacy and publicity in my pedagogy. And so my definitions are similar to Attila's in that I view privacy as a right, as the right of people to protect and control their personal data. And I view publicity as a norm, as a collective norm. So publicity means accountability of powerful institutions, and it means accessibility of critical public information and online infrastructures like LLMs, like ChatGPT. So in this talk, what I'm going to argue, or not argue, but I'm going to describe how I'm trying to do this. So how I'm trying to teach with ChatGPT through a heuristic that I've come up with that's grounded in 3 prepositional orientations, or if you like, disorientations. These are, number 1, teaching technical communication against ChatGPT, teaching tech comm for ChatGPT, and finally teaching tech comm with ChatGPT. And I want to just note right at the beginning here that this is unpublished, ongoing pedagogical practice, not a fully developed research study. So please keep that caveat in mind. I'm still figuring all of this out. All right, so some context. Currently, I teach an Intro to Professional and Technical Writing course that has 3 major projects over a 10-week quarter. We're on the quarter system here at the University of Washington. And so the 3 major projects are a job application package, an instructional design unit, and a change proposal. And I'm going to go through an example of how I teach these genres towards the end of my talk. And that example is going to come from the first major project sequence. But yeah, those are the 3 projects that I'm teaching right now. But I've also taught a range of other tech and professional comm courses. And the heuristic that I'm going to describe, I think could apply to really any kind of technical and professional communication pedagogy. As I incorporate ChatGPT into my courses, I would say that it could be incorporated into any number of these, not just the course I'm teaching right now. So I've taught a workplace research methods course. I've taught professional editing, a career-centric capstone course, a topics in technical communication course on big data privacy and surveillance. And actually, for that course, I used some of the OER resources that Attila has developed on privacy rhetoric, and it was really useful in that course. So shout out to Attila for that. And I've also taught an upper level professional and technical writing course with a data focus. So anyways, oh yeah, and going on just a little bit more about my pedagogy as I set this up. I also discuss and apply several crucial rhetorical and ethical concepts across many different genres of technical communication. So we talk about social justice in my courses from the perspective of diversity, equity, and inclusion, the social implications of different technologies, and power dynamics in different rhetorical situations. We talk about genre, so recurring features of different text types. We talk about audience and usability analysis, so thinking through with each new genre that we're learning and practicing, who are my specific readers and users of this kind of document or communication. And finally, thinking about the document as an artifact of design and rhetorical design. How can you make your documents more readable and more accessible to different kinds of readers? So, okay, back to the heuristic now. So first of all, in the against orientation, students can be introduced to how commercial LLMs like ChatGPT depend upon and potentially exacerbate digital inequities, including privacy inequities. And so the reading that I really like for this is a kind of contemporary classic, Emily Bender, Timnit Gebru, and their co-authors on the dangers of stochastic parrots. Can language models be too big? And what I love about this article, obviously, it established a kind of entire field of critiques of LLMs. But the part that I particularly like to discuss with students is the part about risks and harms. So they go through like a very rich and detailed list of risks and harms that can come from the widespread adoption of LLMs like ChatGPT, including pretty obvious examples like automated paper mills, but also things like harmful output. If there happens to be harmful material in the training data of LLMs, then there's always the possibility that LLMs will output that material, and that material might be traumatic or harmful or offensive in other kinds of ways. Disinformation, I think, is a very familiar concept in critiques of LLMs. And so that's something else that this reading discusses that I find very useful. It talks about social bias and how if training data that's fed into LLMs is biased initially, then the output of LLMs will by default be biased. And we know that LLMs are trained on the existing internet, and the existing internet is certainly biased in all kinds of ways. And so that bias could then be reproduced. And finally, there's an example that I find particularly helpful, which is private info attacks. So to the extent to which the training data of LLMs can be hacked to reverse engineer what's actually contained in that training data through prompt engineering. And that leads into the second orientation that I'm going to discuss here. So in the for orientation, students can analyze and evaluate, and for example, OpenAI's website communications for usability and ethics. So you can do this through a method called usability testing. And obviously there are many different approaches to usability testing, but one that is pretty accessible to a lot of kinds of students is Think Aloud protocol, where you read or use a text or product and think aloud as you're trying to accomplish some task or find some information in the text. And so one activity that I find interesting and useful is to start from OpenAI's website and figure out how to turn off ChatGPT's collection of your chat data for training. And so I'll take you through just, not the actual live think aloud of this, but some moments in this process that I find illustrative, just as an example of this. So if we start from OpenAI's homepage, which just as a general point is very sparse and takes a long time to scroll through and find useful information. But we might think that to figure out how to turn off our chat data being used for model training, we might click the safety button. Okay, so we might try that. Nope. When you click the safety button, it takes you to an extremely abstract and philosophical page on simply the ways in which OpenAI is developing safe and responsible AI, or purports to be. So this doesn't work to achieve our task. So maybe we look a little bit more closely at the navigation bar at the top of the website. We might wonder, are there options underneath the ChatGPT section of the navigation bar that might be helpful? Turns out this is not the case either. The menu options there don't seem relevant to this query at all. So next we can turn to the search bar. We can search for privacy, and we find that there actually are a fair number of results on the overall web page related to privacy. Many of these happen to be blog posts. And so unfortunately, they're seemingly a little bit random. Let's just take a random guess and pick one of these. Let's try introducing GPTs. Well, it turns out that this is quite promising. There's a section in this article called "We Built GPTs with Privacy and Safety in Mind." And there's a link in that section to privacy controls. Now, this is a page that is not prominently showcased at all on OpenAI's homepage, which we can probably imagine some reasons why that might be the case, but hard to find unless we happen to find ourselves on this page. So let's click into the privacy controls. Then we find a help page called Data Controls FAQ. And a little bit into this page, we find, what if I want to keep my history on, but disable model training, which lists some settings that ChatGPT users can modify to turn off the ability of ChatGPT to train using your chat history. And so a takeaway from this exercise is that it's harder than it should be to figure out how to turn off your chat data collection for training. This took 6 or more clicks and actually a lot of luck because I chose a random article to get here. And so I think in this for ChatGPT orientation, we can think about having students analyze and evaluate these kinds of communications for usability and ethics. And similar activities like this could be developed for other risks and harms identified in the scholarship on ChatGPT. So actually testing the extent to which these powerful institutions are making important information accessible through user experience design. Finally, in the with orientation, I do believe that students can use ChatGPT at various stages of what rhetorical scholar Scott Graham calls their recursive and dialogical rhetorical processes. And here I'm drawing from a particular article that Scott Graham wrote last year called Post-Process but Not Post-Writing, Large Language Models and a Future for Composition Pedagogy. And in this article, he advocates a kind of rhetorical design that is reciprocal, that is a reciprocal hermeneutic process, emphasizing iterative, recursive, and dialogic steps. And so to put this in different terms, for each of my current class's 3 major projects, what we've been doing at the outset of the unit is asking ChatGPT to generate samples and then critiquing them. And so these are kind of generic samples, not using any particular student's identity, but asking for general samples. And often what we end up saying is, I will do the opposite of what ChatGPT tells me to do because it does a very bad job in all kinds of ways. So I'll just go through one example of this. So I asked ChatGPT, give me 3 examples of a cover letter targeting a job opportunity in content management. And a few things jumped out of as I was examining ChatGPT's output. The first is that it includes unnecessary address lines at the top of the document that it outputs. And so this is likely a result of cliched training data. So a lot of the cover letter examples that proliferate throughout the internet are very bad and pro forma and cliched. And many of them come from an earlier business context when cover letters were expected to be printed and mailed. And so a lot of addressing information was necessary, but often what I advise students is that you can delete that kind of information to have richer content and more white space on your document. Something else as we dig more deeply into the cover letter is that we see that imagining what the accompanying resume is for this cover letter, it's mostly repeating information that would be on that resume instead of using the affordances of the cover letter as a genre to give richer narrative detail about experiences. And that's the kind of thing that a cover letter does really well, and is simply not present here. Now, there are some basic structural and even stylistic elements of this that are useful that we can point students to, but we can also kind of expose the gaps and expose where the human is missing from these samples. So just to conclude that part, I believe that generating ChatGPT samples and critiquing them as a class can deepen students' metacognition about genre. And often what I've found so far is that it persuades most of them to do their own writing and not outsource their writing to ChatGPT because they see all of these kinds of problems with ChatGPT's output. So just to conclude, LLMs like ChatGPT provide us at least 3 ways to enrich our students' understandings of privacy and publicity. So we can teach technical communication against ChatGPT. We can use it as a case study of privacy and publicity issues with emerging tech. We can teach it for ChatGPT, which involves using it to evaluate and reimagine the public communications of powerful institutions. For example, OpenAI that produces ChatGPT. And finally, we can teach technical communication with ChatGPT, which is to use it to study effective genre performance as a process of learning typical features while avoiding cliches and common pitfalls. All right, so that is my talk. And the last thing I wanted to say here is I wanted to plug my podcast, Reverb. We have 2 episodes about generative AI and technical communication and rhetoric, one with Dr. Emily Bender and one with Dr. Scott Graham. And they're great episodes. And so that's all my time. Thank you so much for listening and being part of this event.
Thank you so much, Calvin. And then last but not least, I'm turning over to Reed.
Okay, thank you. Okay, is everybody able to see my? Okay, fantastic. So just to give you all a little bit of context, I am a digital initiatives librarian, so I'm not an educator. If you are from USU or at USU, I had my undergraduate there, and I worked at the library a lot, so I know a lot of the library people there, but I'm a librarian. And so a lot of my time is spent talking with educators and kind of encouraging them to use AI in certain ways and teach the students that way. So um, uh, so, so while while Dr. Halsby and Dr. Pollock have been talking more about theory and teaching students, I'm going to kind of talk about teaching, educators and teachers about privacy and kind of the basics of how users should interact with generative AI tools. I appreciate both of their comments, especially on the idea of proactively looking at privacy and acting to safeguard privacy rather than just expecting it to be handed and handled by the institutions that create the generative AI tools. So first, a few cautionary tales from my experiences. One user who has ChatGPT 4 and hence has even more of their data analyzed than the typical user has told me that they spend long hours chatting with GPT-4 and the tool knows more about them than their spouse does. Another stated that they put all of their grandchildren's data on a whim into the tool so they could find good gifts for them. Another stated that they put all of the demographic data for their local social group, including some inadvertently identifying data, into the tool, so it would come up with with beneficial activities or programs. And another yet told me that they put all of their financial data so that it would budget for them. And so it is alarmingly clear, terrifyingly clear, that users of all types even those who are informed about these things on a theory level must be more conscientious about their specific practices when when they're dealing with their data and with generative AI tools. The main point of this presentation is essentially that when you practice with AI, when you do things with generative AI tools, and I cannot stress this enough, do not put any sensitive business, individual, or external data for which you are the steward into your prompts. This is a very important point. I originally was going to expand this to cover business confidentiality and things like that, but privacy, I think, is going to be fine here. It's important that you think of the implications of what data you are putting into your prompts, and with text generators or with image generators. Bard specifically notes that human supervisors may read your data, and this has become more explicit with the passage of time. They are essentially saying now, yes, we do read your inputs, and we're always going to. This is why anonymization by the user is extremely important. It is reasonable to assume that human trainers for other tools will also read your inputs. OpenAI's terms of use also discuss the need for propriety. A lot of times, especially when I'm talking with educators who haven't really used AI before, they say, yes, I'm putting personal data into AI, but really I'm me and I'm just one person and they're not really going to use my data. You should not assume this. Do not assume that data harvesters and analyzers will only look at large corporations' data when they're harvesting. Do not think that your data will become buried with others' information and data. This will not happen. Algorithms already exist to examine your individual data and target ads and other outreach programs and initiatives. You should know that that AI developers and those who truly desire to harm you, not saying that those are the same group, but those who have bad intentions will use the data that you openly give to um, AI tools. It's very important that you think not only of the corporations and the institutions that are creating these tools, but also that they can be hacked, that they can be compromised. In order to have a more privacy conscious session with ChatGPT, you can use the platform.openai.com playground iteration of ChatGPT, or you can opt out at privacy.openai.com/policies, or like Dr. Pollack showed, you can go to your personal settings when you're interacting with ChatGPT, and that will have an option for you to opt out of their data collection. Even despite best user efforts, generative AI can extrapolate learning behaviors, engagement patterns, and academic performance, uh, uh, which is another possible privacy harm. It's not enough that you don't put your personal data or explicit data in. You should not put elements of your data in so that AI can extrapolate from them and learn things about you. While these data points are helpful for educators and similar data points can be helpful for professionals, there are multiple concerns. Essentially, for every data point you share with generative AI tools that are trained to extrapolate, there are multiple data points that can be inferred, and this can be made more precise with every other data point you share in a prompt. The extrapolated profile is increasingly calibrated with every interaction. Even if it doesn't get things right, these can be used to exacerbate biases and discrimination by institutions and by people against certain groups, marginalized groups. The process of extrapolation in AI, as it infers information beyond the training data, can inadvertently reveal sensitive personal data. This is particularly concerning in educational settings where the privacy of students' data is paramount. For instance, an AI system might infer a student's learning disabilities or mental health issues based on their interaction patterns, even if such information was not explicitly provided. This extrapolation process, while useful for personalized learning, can also be a gateway for privacy invasion and must be managed with strict data governance protocols. This is a sample post that I put on a LinkedIn, or excuse me, on a Facebook group, and obviously I did not post this. This would be alarming if I did. All of this information is false except for my name. But imagine that you are putting this out in public and you're posting this on a local social media group. Essentially, that's kind of what you're doing in a more removed way when you're putting your personal data in. If privacy data can be found from hackers, your data could end up anywhere. Um, and it's something to keep in mind, that if you put in your location, or you put in I'm looking for something for Twin Falls, Idaho. I'm looking, and then in another prompt you put in I'm looking for something about for a community college I work at. It can put those together and and find that out about you, and it will record that to help its processes in the future. And so these are things that I tell educators. This is kind of where where we're going to talk about teaching about privacy. I encourage educators to talk to their students about these three things. First, encourage transparent data collection. When you're talking to students, that means you should know what they're collecting about you, how they're collecting it. You should opt out if you feel comfortable, which you probably should. Inform students and patrons about the data that is being collected and its purpose. Only Claude.ai and ChatGPT explicitly deny extrapolating data and storing it, especially if you opt out of that, and their terms appear to support these claims. But Perplexity evades the question, and Google Bard explicitly supports the idea and tells the user how to extrapolate and store data. So it is alarming that even though ChatGPT and ChatGPT specifically explicitly denies extrapolating data, evidence shows that it might not be as secure as it claims. Perplexity won't answer the question, and Bard says that yes, I do extrapolate data, and you can as well if you want to. Informed consent. You should obtain explicit consent before collecting personal information, which means you should, as a user, you should know what personal information is being collected. When you put in custom instructions to any tool, be aware of what you're telling it about yourself. And then again, limit data collection to what is essential, or in other words, limit what you put in there. Again, kind of the three ways of saying the same thing, but in different words, in different contexts. There are some important principles of the OpenAI terms of use, and I am focusing on OpenAI because it's one of the largest organizations. They're obviously the creators of Bard and Perplexity and Bing. They have their different terms of use, but OpenAI says that input and output are collectively content, and they assign, as much as they can, and that's another discussion, the copyright of all the output to you. You are responsible for all the content, including ensuring that it does not violate any applicable law or these terms. You represent and warrant the of all rights, licenses, and permissions needed to provide input to our services. As between you and OpenAI, and to the extent permitted by applicable law, you retain your ownership rights in input and only output. And the rest of the terms can be read at openai.com/policies/terms of use. Again, to have a more privacy conscious session with ChatGPT, you can go to privacy.openai.com/policies, or use the playground version of ChatGPT on platform.openai.com. In essence, data protection practices and safeguards in regards to generative AI are the same principles and practices that we've used to protect our data from actors, malicious and interfering and corporate. And so the only thing we have to do in a general context is be extra vigilant, more vigilant, and put the principles to use in new practices with these new tools. Previously, we have been worried about people coming across that information or using it by buying it or being handed it from institutions, corporations, or vendors. Now we can deliberately and directly give our private and confidential data to generative AI tools, or as mentioned above, those tools and their creators can extrapolate that data from what we have done and then give it to other actors. While Sean Falconer, who is a writer of one of my sources, laments that there is no delete button for generative AI tools to forget the data collected by companies, tools, and programs. The truth is that even with those delete buttons, our data is still sold and retained. Hence, in some ways, generative AI is no more dangerous than institutions that have our data from their own processes or from third parties with whom we have transacted. In some ways, I must stress that. I also create and provide AI tools. And one of the things that I tell people who want to create AI tools, including one at my institution who wants to create some for each department in the program, I tell these educators to tell their students, never promise users or individuals who are using your LLMs or your customers who are trusting you with their data that you have created a completely secure generative AI tool or model. You should ensure that your users know the ethical implications of the tool, and that yes, the tool could be relatively isolated and you could not voluntarily give data to the model creator. However, they do not yet come with deliberate and explicit data access control that is truly effective. One of my one of the people I follow on LinkedIn, and he gave me permission to share this. He created a GPT called Break Me, and in 4 days, someone broke it. I tried to use, base 64 encryption, base 32 encryption, encoded images, blank images, and I wasn't able to break it. But someone did by using a deceased grandmother prompt hack, in which um, this user told GPT to interact as their deceased grandmother and tell them all these things, and he was able to get the source and knowledge uh, documents for that GPT. And this demonstrates first that hacking a GPT isn't about writing code; it's more about having a conversation and getting the GPT to trust you. And that, secondly, and most importantly, your models aren't safe, your tools aren't safe, and so we should never assume that tools are going to always be safe. Finally, some specific recommendations for safeguarding privacy. First, avoid explicit information and private details. It can be tempting for users to think of the AI tool as another human being. We all know professionals who have worked with AI tools so much that they believed that they were sentient and had abilities which are not in the domain of generative AI. In a similar way, we can let our guard down and share information with generative AI tools as we would our friends or trusted confidants. Um, Avoid mentioning any generic factors of your life, and implement and enforce strict access and use controls for yourself and your students. Have family members or friends or peers read over your prompts. Use AI to detect when you're sharing private information, which is a snake swallowing itself. Never assume that opting out will protect privacy, and never put individual people's attributes into their prompts. Here are my references, and thank you very much for listening to this, and I hope that I was able to add something valuable to this conversation.
Thank you so much, Reed, Kelvin, and Attila. I took a lot of notes. There's a lot of new things I learned today. We do have a few minutes, not too much time, a few minutes for questions if anybody has any questions for our panelists. I have a question. Maybe I'll ask Attila. I wonder how, and maybe. Oh, never mind. Let me do a question from the audience. Okay, so Charles has a question. How can we think through a concept like data minimization when everything about big data seems overwhelming and abstract? I think that's a better question than mine. Any thoughts?
I feel like I want to hear how Attila would answer this one. But I'm also curious Charles, what you mean by data minimization, if you could expand on that at all. Would that mean like users trying to minimize the amount of data that they produce about themselves?
So I guess I'll answer a little bit, and then I want to hear both yours, Calvin, and Attila's thing. What I mean is, you should only provide the minimum number of specifics, if at all, for the prompts. A lot of prompting guides, and this is a good advice, tell the prompter to be specific and give context and give examples of all these things, but you should not put your personal data in that. And I would be careful to only put publicly available data essentially use as few identifying data about yourself or about the subject as you can.
We have another question in the Q&A, and I wonder if, seems like it could be connected if we think about the US still doesn't have a proper federal data privacy law. At this point, if one were to pass, would it even make a difference?
Well, I'm happy to sort of to quickly tackle both of those questions at once, about data minimization and then also about this policy. I think that the answer to both of them is that the underwriting problem is that somehow there is a volitional element to this, as if the user themselves can exercise choices that will be sufficient to safeguard them. But based on my experiences speaking with my undergraduate students, many of them have very little understanding of what it would be, what is necessary in order to make the most basic internet traffic that they undertake private. Right. The idea of a VPN is frequently something that I introduce them to. The idea that their browsers have security flaws is new to them. And so this goes well beyond like being able to be elective about what you put into something like ChatGPT, and any policy that is going to be formed is going to be not, I sort of agree with the framing of the question in that it is going to be lackluster insofar as the presumption of choice that somehow the user's ability to control the flow of their own information is already going to be presumed within any sort of data policy there. So I would be happy to see something like what the EU has implemented, but honestly, those are half measures relative to the fact that something that is seen to be liberating, the equivalent of freedom, namely the ability to choose and exercise choice, is actually one of the things that is most limiting about both generative AI and any sort of privacy regulation that you would want to undertake. So that's I think how those two questions perhaps even dovetail with one another.
Yeah, I guess the only other thing I would add is that I think that a lot of these policy initiatives have carve-outs for governments and for policing agencies, and that's something that I've been very concerned about in my research and like general politics over many years, right? And so that's another side to this, that like we're often talking about corporate data collection and privacy invasion, and sort of taking for granted that governments are going to surveil and policing agencies are going to surveil. And I totally agree that like opt-out is not a solution. And I hope that in my example of showing like how we would figure out how to opt out of training data collection, I wasn't like endorsing that as a solution, but I also think it's an interesting exercise in analyzing how difficult it is to even get to that setting using OpenAI's website. And so, yeah, it's a very complicated, difficult situation.
Thank you so much. We are at time. Thank you so much for coming from all over the country. I hope you also will check out the other events for the week. And thank you again to Attila, Calvin, and Reed for sharing your expertise.
Thanks, Chen. Thank you to everyone for coming.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Bye.